This is the story of American freedom. So it was that the first Congress, meeting under this new Constitution, in 2 years solved problems of the most tremendous magnitude and significance. The Bill of Rights is still with us today. It guarantees our freedom every day. The great states like Michigan and Mississippi are part of our union. But for the moment, the most important accomplishment was to pay off the national debt. Because you see, the founders studied history. They studied ancient history. They studied modern history. And they knew, as Jefferson said, that a huge national debt has been the ruin of every country in history. By paying off that debt, by establishing a sound currency, by issuing sound United States bonds, Hamilton laid the foundation for the credit of the new country. And in 1789, when the Revolutionary War broke out in France, when the European financial system was in chaos, there was only one safe place for European investors to put their money, and that was this new country which had proven its financial responsibility. And this influx of European investments laid the foundation for the prosperity for generations to come. But what are the roots of this remarkable American ideal of freedom that achieved one of its high points in our Constitution and Bill of Rights? For it is an ideal of freedom that goes far back, all the way back to the Old Testament, to Greece and Rome, to Christianity, to England. Now today, we live in a very diverse America. I speak to you only of the roots of American freedom as they were for the founders, for Abraham Lincoln, and for the United States right up until World War II. What shaped the unique American ideal of freedom? Number one, the Old Testament. We don't want to think much about that today, but the Old Testament was a living, breathing source of ideas for the founders of our country. Just look at their names drawn from the Old Testament. Read the sermons of their ministers preached from backwoods pulpits and pulpits in Boston, comparing the British to the Amalekites who must be wiped out forever. So the Old Testament, coming with the founders to Jamestown, coming with them to Boston, all of this was fundamental to their view of freedom. One, from the Old Testament, the founders derived the ideal of a set of rules, of laws, under which you must live. The 10 Commandments. And to the founders, the 10 Commandments were a statement of natural law, the law of God. Secondly, the ideal of a chosen people. This has been forever with America. The ideal that just as God had chosen out ancient Israel to be his chosen people, so he had chosen the Americans. Herman Melville, writing later, expressed it when he said, "America is the new Israel, chosen by God to bear the ark of liberties to the world." Abraham Lincoln, was profoundly influenced by the Old Testament. Its vision of a righteous God, a God who would send a civil war upon a people who had borne the sin of slavery. So a chosen people, we still hear it today. In recent presidential campaigns, I've heard both candidates say, America is a model to the world. And it is this belief that we are a chosen people. Even if we stand aside from the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments today publicly, it is this idea that we are a chosen people that still leads us to undertake these crusades, as we see them, to spread our ideals and our values to the world. So the Ten Commandments, as a statement of the everlasting law of God and of the necessity of man to live under that law of God, and America as a chosen people. Greece and Rome. In 1787, when the founders of our country were looking for models for a new republic in a new world, how many functioning republics or democracies were there in 1787? The Venetian Republic, a dying relic. The Dutch Republic, corrupt. No, as I have told you, it was absolute benevolent despotism that was the government of the future. You look for a single strong ruler. The Roman Empire was your model, in which an emperor like Augustus or Trajan gave justice and unity to the entire world. And every citizen of this vast empire enjoyed liberty under the auspices of one great ruler chosen by God. But the founders looked back to antiquity. They looked back to classical Greece and to classical Rome. Their minds were sharpened by the reading of the Roman historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC about the rise of the Roman Empire and why Rome had risen to greatness because of its balanced constitution. They learned the perils of a democracy that tried to be a superpower from the pages of the historian Thucydides, detailing the fall of the Athenian Empire in the 5th century BC. They learned the dangers of tyranny from the pages of the Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 2nd century AD. And much of this for them was filtered through the pages of Baron Montesquieu, whose Spirit of the Laws, written in 1747, drew heavily upon the lessons of Greece and Rome to provide a model for what a good government should be. And indeed, Polybius is the most frequently quoted work in the conventions, both the Constitutional Convention and the ratifying conventions, as Montesquieu is the most frequently quoted modern work. So what came from Greece and Rome? Well, first of all, the very idea of democracy. Demokratia, power of the people. In ancient Mesopotamia, there was a king chosen by God, from whom all law came. The Egyptians, that brilliant people that erected the pyramids, they did not even have a word in their language for freedom. All power rested in Pharaoh, a god on earth. It was the Greeks who first said, we can govern ourselves. Government rests upon the consent of the people. And I suggest to you that no nation has ever truly understood freedom that was not touched by the genius of the Greeks. Greeks like the Athenians with Marathon defended their democracy against an enormous army of Persians. Greeks like the Spartans who died there at Thermopylae. Greeks who came together, 31 city-states at Salamis, to defeat the might of Persia. And, in the view of the historian Herodotus, established forever that free men can always conquer the slaves of a despot. So the very idea of democracy came to them, our founders, from Greece. And with it the idea of a written constitution. They knew well the life of Plutarch, biographer writing in the 2nd century AD, so admired by the founders that one of them suggested that a copy of the lives of Plutarch, his lives of the noble Greeks and Romans, be put in every library and every school in this country. Benjamin Franklin was an avid reader of Plutarch. And Plutarch wrote his life of Solon and his description of how a lawgiver can sit down and give a written constitution to a nation based ultimately upon democracy. So the very word of democracy, the idea of a democratic constitution, and with it also the ideal of the freedom of conscience. That is what Socrates taught, the freedom of the individual conscience. Your right to do what you think is right, no matter if the entire majority says no. He died for that ideal, the right to conscience. And when the founders spoke of your freedom to exercise your religion, what they truly meant was your freedom to speak your conscience. That is still perhaps the most difficult thing for us to do today. To say, I know I am right. I know everybody else disagrees with me. I know I may die if I speak the truth. But I am going to speak it. It can still motivate great change. It struck the very chords of a nation when Martin Luther King and the movement against segregation began. He spoke movingly in his letter from a Birmingham jail of that freedom of conscience so fundamental to our very existence as human beings. From Rome, above all, they took the ideal of a balanced constitution. Our own constitution was carefully crafted following the model of the Constitution of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic was based upon an absolute democracy in the form of the people. The only laws that could be passed, war and peace could only be declared perhaps by the Roman people, meeting as a whole in their assembly. But they needed guidance. They needed the guidance of wise men. And so foreign policy was guided by 300 senators serving for life, not directly elected. As you'll recall, the senators under our original Constitution were appointed by the state legislators, not voted by the people. So indirectly elected, these 300 senators guided the foreign policy of Rome, and it was the tradition of Rome that no law would be presented to the assembly of the people unless the Senate had first made a recommendation upon it. And thus, there was the ideal that democracy is the foundation of our government, but that democracy must be restrained and controlled by wisdom. a division of governmental functions, a strong commander-in-chief, the consul, 2 of them elected every year, commander-in-chief, and with modifications, our ideal of the president was founded upon that of the Roman consul. And the right of the Senate alone to control finances. That is fundamental to our Constitution. The president cannot spend a penny. The president cannot raise a penny on his own. That power rests with Congress. And so too in ancient Rome, as the founders learned. The consul could lead the army wherever he wished, but unless the Senate gave him the money, it was futile. So these checks and balances, so central to our government, were learned by the founders from ancient Rome. It was within the framework of the Roman Empire that Christianity arose and spread. And Christianity was fundamental to the founders' ideal of freedom. Christianity endowed the individual human soul with a dignity never before known. After all, in the Christian view, God had so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believeth in him should have everlasting life. That very concept of the unique worth of every individual person should still be with us every day today. I worry that we forget it. In fact, I worry that as a society, we are moving more and more to the idea that not every individual has a unique worth, that some have more worth than others, that some benefit should be given only to a few. But founders believed that we were all, ultimately, in God's own good time, to be free and equal. No less important was the ideal of natural law. In our discussion of the Declaration of Independence, we have seen that the idea of natural law was fundamental to the founding of our country. It is an idea that we already find expressed in ancient Greece, but above all in Rome. It was defined by the great Roman patriot and lawyer, willing to give his life for the freedom of Rome, Marcus Tullius Cicero. It was defined as the wisdom of God and the reason of God as revealed in nature. It was a set of laws based upon absolute truths, such as absolute beauty, absolute courage, absolute moderation, absolute justice. That was true in all places and in all times, as true in Athens as it was in Rome, as it would one day be true in America. It cannot be changed. And there are the most severe consequences for those who break natural law. But natural law is a complicated matter. The perfection of natural law is that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that exists only in the world of God, in the perfection of God. And as Thomas Jefferson fully understood, as those who read his words fully understood, as they had learned from their textbooks in moral philosophy, that is not true here on earth. And so natural law, the law of God, is divided into two further parts. the law of the whole human race, jus gentium, and then below that, jus civile, the laws of the individual nations of the earth. And there can be no perfection. In every society that has existed, slavery has existed. Tell me, after the 10th commandment, what is the next paragraph? Any one of you a minister? Tell me. It's how to deal with a Hebrew slave. Paul writes a letter to Philemon. He does not condemn slavery. He says, be a good slave or a good master. So every society and the whole human race must deal with the institution of slavery. And every nation has its own means of dealing with the institution of slavery. How do you free a slave? It's different in ancient Greece than it is in Rome. The founders were not hypocrites, but they understood from natural law that slavery was an institution that existed among them. It could not be ended immediately. Most of them believed it was morally wrong, but it was impossible to end immediately. And thus they waited for God in his own good time to put an end to slavery. So the law of nature existing in God, the law of the whole human race, which has basic fundamental issues, adultery, what is murder, and then the law of each individual nation that will deal differently with adultery. Is having 4 wives adulterous? Each nation deals with it individually. But this came to the founders right through Roman law. And the great law code of Justinian, compiled in the 6th century AD, the epitome of Roman law, begins by saying that all men are created equal. And they are endowed with fundamental rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that in the world of man, this cannot be. But that ideal was there, and it carried the founders to their understanding of the Declaration of Independence. Next, and perhaps most important, was the legacy of England. The founders of this country were Englishmen. They believed that they were defending their traditional rights as Englishmen. That George III, like every king in English history, was trying to take away their rights. This went right back to the very settlement of Britain in the 5th and 6th and 7th century by the Anglo-Saxons. It was believed, based on the Roman historian Tacitus and Montesquieu, that these Germanic invaders of Britain had brought with them fundamental ideals of freedom, such as democracy, a trial by jury, the right to bear arms, and that the gradual history of England had been the rise of the ideas of fundamental liberties. One of these was the common law. King Henry, from 1154 to 1189, was fundamental in establishing a unique form of jurisprudence, different from Roman jurisprudence. The common law of England, which meant it was the law common to the realm as a whole. And under it were guaranteed your right to a jury trial, your right to a speedy trial, the fact that your home was your castle, as was said during the Watergate investigations. The wind and rain can enter the house of the most humble Englishman, but the king in all his majesty may not. On June the 15th, 1215, a date that should be as sacred to us as July the 4th, a group of rebellious barons and rebellious common people forced King John to sign the Magna Carta there on the field of Runnymede, declaring these fundamental rights of Englishmen that the king may not infringe upon. He may not keep a standing army except with consent of Parliament. He must call regular meetings of Parliament. He cannot raise taxes without the consent of Parliament. And every Englishman has his fundamental rights guaranteed. Oh, now time and time again, English kings tried to impose their will. King Charles tried to impose his will, convinced that his power came from God and that he didn't need Parliament. Parliament had revolted against him. In 1649, defeated him and brought him to trial. He wouldn't stand up before the jury, wore his hat the whole time as a sign of lack of respect. Well, they cut that head off, and that pretty much showed who ran England. 1688, King James, complete fool, but very learned, and learned enough to believe his power came from God, and that he could choose his religion as a Catholic. Well, once again, he was run out of the country. His own daughter deserted him, and with her husband William from Holland, became king and queen of England, Queen Mary and King William. But Parliament said, wait just a minute. Before you're really kings and queen, you've got to issue this Declaration of Rights. Why, no, that's an infringement upon our powers. You will issue a Declaration of Rights, proclaiming the rights of Parliament and the rights of Englishmen. And it was on these fundamental rights, such as trial by jury. I am so disturbed when people today disparage juries. To the founders, they were the very basis of our freedom. Writ of habeas corpus, freedom to travel, freedom of an Englishman to bear a weapon suited to his station. And so King William and Queen Mary signed this Declaration of Rights. Thus, when 1775 came, and those brave Americans took their place at Lexington, they were simply doing what Englishmen had done for centuries in the past, fighting for their legitimate freedoms against a tyrannical foe, a tyrannical king. The Old Testament, Greece and Rome, Christianity, the English tradition of freedom. These all flowed into America. But what stirred them up, what made them bubble into a unique ideal of freedom, was the frontier.
The story of freedom in America with Dr. J. Rufus Fears is made possible by the generous support of our Freedom and Heritage sponsors. The Story of Freedom in America is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma, in partnership with the Alumni Association of the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.